Welcome to 2819. This is the show where we aim to inspire you to go and make disciples of all nations. I'm Sandra Dimez.
And I'm Brian Rohenbacher, and this is the television outreach of Reasons to Believe, a viewer-supported ministry where science and faith converge.
And as we're watching, we hope that you will just take some of what we're communicating here, and that'll help encourage you to step into conversations and to share your faith with compassion and confidence.
And while you're watching the show, make sure you get connected with us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at 2819 Show. I love spending time on the internet, so make sure you leave some comments for me to read.
And also, we have some news. We have a podcast version of our show. It's now available on iTunes and Google Play, so you can listen on the go to full episodes. Plus, you can catch our Straight Thinking podcasts. So just search for Reasons to Believe podcast on iTunes or Google Play, and you'll find us.
All right, now let's get started with a quick rundown of today's show. In RTB 101, Krista Bontrager asked astronomer Hugh Ross a common question about the creation days. When was the sun created?
Yep, it's a very common question, and a lot of kids get it in Sunday school, so it'll be a good topic, especially for parents, to check out. And if you've ever wondered how first century Christians defended their faith, that's such a good question. You want to check out our Nexus segment with Jo Vitale, itinerant speaker for Ravi Zacharias International Ministries.
And you might have seen this recent article floating around the internet about human consciousness being caused by a virus.
Yeah, it's one of those discoveries that can seem to imply that God wasn't involved. So you want to check that out.
Jeff Swearing, Fazale Rana, and Ken Samples will discuss what this discovery means for Christian faith in our Give and Take segment.
Then in our RTB News segment, Monica will talk with Anjeanette Roberts about RTB's latest book, Building Bridges. It's co-authored by Fazale Rana, Anjeanette Roberts, and Jeff Swearing.
But first up is Culture Talk. Sandra's going to talk with Fazale Rana about the Laminin cross. Does it provide evidence for God? Let's check that out.
Welcome to Culture Talk. This is the segment where we talk about everything from books and films to things you're going to see on social media. And the purpose is to really help you engage in conversation and use these topics to share your faith. I'm joined today with my friend and colleague, biochemist Fazale Rana. We're going to be talking about when bad memes happen to good Christians. And we have a specific tie-in. I don't know if you've seen things like this online, but a sweet woman who I love very much, she recently shared a thing where she's not ashamed to have Jesus on her wall. Unfortunately, the picture she shared was of Obi-Wan, and that kind of has happened before, and it's not shared ironically. So another common thing, that's obviously an error, right, but some things aren't very obvious, and some of those things, one of them in particular is the laminin protein. So before we dive into the arguments, can you tell us first what is the laminin protein?
Yeah, laminin is actually a very important protein that plays a role in maintaining the structural integrity of tissues in our body. And tissues are comprised up of cells that then secrete materials to form this very thin sheet called the extracellular matrix. And that sheet is made up of proteins and polysaccharides that interact to form this meshwork. And that meshwork anchors the cells to the extracellular matrix and even helps to hold cells together with respect to one another. So laminin is helping to hold our bodies together.
Okay, so then let's talk about the shape of laminin, because when we think of laminin holding things together and now the shape, that's where we get into the potentially tricky area.
That's right. Well, laminin is a T-shaped molecule, and in fact, it has a number of binding sites along the arms, along the four arms, that are used for it to interact with these other materials that are part of the extracellular matrix and to interact with cells. But because it has a T shape, and because it's helping to hold things together, there's a fairly well-known Christian pastor who's pointed out, this is scientific support for Colossians 1, 15 to 17 that says Jesus holds everything together. So the idea that if there are these little crosses in our tissues that are holding us together, then that's proof that Jesus must be holding us together.
Right. And that's such a beautiful idea, but is it scientifically accurate?
No, it's really a very bad argument. First of all, laminin, the T shape that we see, for example, if you look it up online, is what biochemists call an idealized structure, which means it's just a way to represent the molecule so that biochemists can make out critical structural details that help them understand how the molecule behaves. In fact, the arms are really very floppy, and this is actually necessary for laminin to play its role in binding other materials together and holding things together. It has to be able to undergo contortions. Well, the most common shape for laminin in tissues is probably that of a swastika, not a cross. So it's really not a good argument.
Yeah, so that's not something that we want to be supporting, that we have little swastikas all inside of us that hold us together.
No, not at all. We don't want to do that.
So then when we see something like that, someone that we know is a Christian and they are well-meaning, and that's something that we want to remember, that they're well-meaning, but how do we then have a conversation? Maybe that's offline, or what does that look like? Because we want to, of course, maintain that relationship, but we also want to help non-Christians see that we are able to kind of challenge things gently. And so what would you recommend?
In my experience, Christians are really very much concerned with truth, and they want to get things right. So if you approach it that way, with gentleness, but with some firmness, I think that helps. And as you mentioned, people are well-meaning and well-intentioned. And in my experience, if you take something away from somebody, it's really important to give them something in return, maybe even better. And there's loads of wonderful, very powerful arguments for God's existence and that can be used to build a bridge to the gospel from biochemistry. And so we're better off teaching people to use those good arguments as opposed to this argument that isn't the best.
Right. Well, thank you. That's a really good point. Take away something, give something back. That's very helpful. Thank you so much for that, Fuz. If you want to hear more from Dr. Fazale Rana, check out reasons.org, and you can search for laminin to find more on this topic. Next, we're going to head over to our Nexus segment, where Jo Vitale from RZIM explains to us how first century Christians defended their faith. Let's check it out.
Gosh, it's such a wonderful question to ask. What were the challenges that first century Christians were facing? Because I think the more we look into scripture and read the New Testament, particularly the book of Acts, the more we see actually a lot of their challenges are very similar to the ones that we are facing even today. Except I would say it was harder for them than it is for us, which I take great comfort in, because I think sometimes as Christians, particularly in a culture where we're in now, where so often we feel like things are getting harder for us and we think, oh, woe is me, no one ever had it this hard. And then you look at the first century and you realize, my goodness me, they had it so much harder than we did. I mean, there are so many competing philosophies of the day, if we're talking about Greek and Roman culture. Actually, interestingly, some of them similar to the ones we wrestle with today. I was on UC Berkeley's campus not long ago, this time last year actually, and two of the predominant views I saw on campus were both the New Age and naturalism. And yet you go back to Paul speaking to the Athenians 2,000 years ago, and you find that the Epicureans had a very similar view to naturalists today in terms of believing in randomness and chance, and God was at best deistic, but really not interested in the world and in creation. And the Stoics, on the other hand, very much believed in sort of fate and emphasis with harmony on nature. So the philosophies were similar in some ways. And then, of course, you have the challenges of being a minority group who are stirring up trouble in a culture where you're welcome to believe anything you like as long as you don't claim that your truth is the only truth. And so, of course, the reaction to that for first century Christians was persecution of the highest order, whether it was being stoned or crucified or thrown to the lions. So different kinds of challenges the first century Christians faced. What amazes me is the way that they persevered despite all of that they went out of their way to engage with the culture, to understand the questions that people were asking. They didn't go in trying to start fights, but instead they looked for commonalities, points of engagement, bridges to the other culture, and then they set Christianity alongside that. And in doing that, they pointed to the greatest piece of evidence they had, which was the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and something that many of them themselves had seen and witnessed, and seen the risen Christ before them. So they had a compelling testimony to share. And what amazes me the most actually is looking back on that culture. Within 30 years of the death of Jesus, we see the two primary centers of Christianity being destroyed. Both the Roman Church, the Christians are expelled and put to death, and then you see the same thing happening in Jerusalem, where the Christians are all kicked out. So they're under tremendous persecution, and yet, despite all of that, we see Christianity exploding across the ancient world. And I think the reason for that is because they had had a living encounter with Jesus Christ, and they knew that he really was the real God, and therefore whatever came against them, at the end of the day, it just didn't it didn't compare to the life that they had found in Christ and the commitment they had to making him known because they love God and because they love the world.
If you'd like to find out more about Jo Vitale and her work with Ravi Zacharias Ministries, you can find her on Twitter at Joanna_Vitale. And now it's time for RTB 101. This is the segment where we talk about practical questions to help equip you to share your faith with friends and family more effectively. And once again, I'm here with my colleague and minister of the gospel, Dr. Hugh Ross.
Hello.
And Hugh, there is a question that comes up a lot of confusion that our unsaved friends have is this business about when was the sun created? Because kind of a superficial reading of Genesis 1, it seems like it was created on day 4, but that has some chronological problems. So help us think through when did the sun appear or what's happening here in the biblical text?
Well, Krista, let's go back to the beginning. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And you know there's no word in biblical Hebrew for universe, but they got this phrase, the heavens and the earth, always used to refer to the totality of physical reality. That's when God created matter, energy, space, and time. And then what we see on creation day 1, let there be light. That's when the light that God created in the beginning first shows up on the surface of the earth. And notice Genesis 1:2, darkness covers the face of the deep. It's dark because God had blanketed the seas of the earth with clouds that kept the light out. So creation day 1 miracle, God transforms the atmosphere from opaque to translucent.
Okay, so let me make sure I got the sequence of events. Genesis 1:1, God created the heavens and the earth. That would include the sun as
Sun,
being
moon, and stars are
part
all
of the
included
heavens.
there, right?
That's part of the set of the heavens.
Right.
Genesis 1:2, then we switch the point of view to the surface of the earth,
Right.
but it's cloudy.
Right.
So the sun is there, but we can't see it.
It's not only cloudy, the clouds won't let any light through at all. It's like
Okay.
the clouds on Venus.
Okay, and then we get to creation day 1. We can start to see the light from the sun,
Right.
which has been there since verse 1.
Right.
But now that light is coming through the clouds.
But it's like it's permanently overcast. You
Okay.
can see the sun's light, but you can't see the sun.
Okay.
Not until the 4th day does God transform the atmosphere to translucent. And I think this is clear because it says in verse 14, let there be the great lights so that they may serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years. Obvious question, for whose benefit? Well, notice the animals aren't mentioned until day 5.
Okay.
And they're the only life forms on planet Earth that need to see the position of the sun, moon, and stars in order to regulate their biological clocks.
So in anticipation, God knows, okay, I'm going to make animals.
Right.
I need to have a sky where the sun, moon, and stars are visible to help the animals that are coming regulate their body clocks.
Right,
Okay,
right.
perfect. So then there's always this question of the word made in verse 16, because it says God made the great lights. That kind of sounds like they're appearing for the first time. So help me understand
Yeah,
that.
verse 16 says God made the sun, moon, and stars. Verse 14, God let there be the great lights. So it's basically saying these objects that creatures have seen in the sky for the first time, let me tell you what they are. They're objects that God made. Now, it doesn't tell you when he made them. The implication is he made them sometime in the past, and it's simply not disclosed in that verse exactly when he made them in the past. But if you go back to Genesis 1:1 to 1:3, they were made before the atmosphere was made translucent.
Perfect. So they were made at some point in the past that's not defined,
Right.
which could be all the way back in verse 1.
Right.
Okay, I think I'm clear on that. So then that answers the common skeptic question of how did plants survive before the sun?
Right.
The sun was there. It was just cloudy.
Yeah, the heat and the light of the sun were there, so plants could survive, but the animals needed to know where those objects were.
Oh, that's perfect. Okay, so this is really going to help me when I'm talking to my non-believing friends to help them make sense of what Genesis 1 says, that it's not scientific nonsense, but it actually fits with what we
Fits
know.
perfectly with the science.
That's great. Thanks, Hugh. And I want to encourage everyone to check out Hugh's blog, Today's New Reason to Believe. You can get that on our website at reasons.org. Now let's go over to the scholar team. They're talking about the internet rumor floating around that human consciousness is caused by a virus.
Hello, Jeff Zwaring here again with Give and Take, where we look at the latest scientific ideas to help you be more confident in sharing your faith. Today I'm joined by my colleagues Fazale Rana and Ken Samples, and we're going to look at a provocative idea. Are viruses responsible for what we Christians call the image of God? Ken, Fuzz, good to have you here today.
Hi,
So
Jeff.
I saw a headline said that an ancient virus may be responsible for human consciousness. So this idea that our ability to be aware of who we are being made in the image of God, that it looks like these viruses are responsible. What do we do with such a headline?
Yeah, well, I saw that article, Jeff, too. And the first thing that I want to point out is that this is a beautiful example of how many times headlines for science in the news articles are extremely provocative and sensationalistic, and many times have actually very little to do with the actual article or the scientific discoveries that the article is based on.
So you're saying to me when I see a provocative headline, I actually need to go look at the article to figure out what's going on?
Yeah, you need to dig a little bit deeper. And part of what's going on here is that writers and editors are trying to get the reader attention so that they are going to read the article. So we want to be careful not to base what we think science is saying on the headlines themselves.
I think that's pretty important. I've found very much the same thing, that the provocative headlines are what they are at some times. So tell me a little bit, okay, so if it's not about explaining consciousness, what is it that the article was dealing with?
Yeah, well, this is actually a really nicely written article that's based on some really nice work done by researchers that were trying to understand the biochemical basis for how neurons form connections with one another.
This is kind of how they communicate with one another, if you will.
Exactly.
Okay.
So whenever information is processed through our brains, the net result is that neurons actually begin to form networks, and they have to connect with one another to form those networks. And it turns out that the biochemical mechanism for how that takes place is very similar to the way in which a retrovirus infection will be transmitted from one cell to the other. So on the basis of that similarity, they conclude that in an animal in the distant past, a retroviral infection was incorporated into the genome of that animal, and then later evolution co-opted that mechanism and then made use of it to help to evolve and sculpt through evolutionary processes the brains of animals and ultimately the brains of humans. So the argument is our ability for conditioning, for learning, for advanced cognitive abilities is ultimately due to this chance retroviral infection.
So that kind of raises a very obvious question. Let's just say all this is true. Does that mean that evolution is correct?
Well, I would say as an old earth creationist, no, because we have to keep in mind people are looking at data from their own particular worldview. So from an evolutionary perspective, that conclusion is reasonable. But from an old earth creationist perspective, I could look at that data and say, well, just because there's similar designs doesn't mean that it means a creator wasn't involved. We use the same designs over and over again in different contexts as human designers, so why wouldn't a creator use the same designs in different ways in the created order?
So when we see these similarities, it doesn't necessarily mean we've got a common ancestor. It could just be a reflection that there's a designer using common designs.
Exactly,
over and over. So
yes.
That's very fascinating. So Ken, I would like you to get involved in the discussion here, because this is something that as Christians, this is important, how we're conscious, how we're made in the image of God. How do we think theologically? How do we think well about discoveries like this, assuming that they all play out and are true?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would note is that when you read neuroscientists, when you read philosophers of mind, explaining consciousness is very, very difficult. And candid naturalists will tell you they are pained to try to explain consciousness. Now, from a biblical point of view, human beings are made from the dust of the ground. The dust of the ground, the breath of life is what creates human beings. And so human beings are a reflection, and most Christians would agree with this, that there is a dual nature, that there is the material and the non-material, or the physical and the spiritual. So our consciousness reflects our soulishness, if you will. And there is a union of those two. Human beings are a union of body and soul. That's the basic dualist position, and that is the consensus of historic Christianity.
That doesn't surprise me at all, but I have to say, as I've thought about that in the past, that my inclination was to think, okay, I've got my body, that kind of behaves one way, I've got my spirit, that kind of behaves the other way. It seems like what you're saying is that they're not these two independent things, that they're distinct, but they also influence one another.
Absolutely, and I would say, as Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic philosopher, he said in the intermediate state, which is where we're separate from our body but awaiting the resurrection, that we're not fully human. And I have no doubt that our soul influences our body and our body influences our soul. I think that makes good biblical sense.
So scientifically, how might we expect that to play out if we're a union of body and spirit, that they mutually influence one another? What would we expect to see scientifically?
Well, I think that we shouldn't be surprised to see that there are these brain mechanisms that are responsible for our ability to think in sophisticated ways, that these mechanisms might even explain our emotions, maybe even the attraction that we have for one another. But just because, again, we're seeing these physical mechanisms doesn't mean that there's not a spiritual aspect to who we are as human beings. I like to think of it as our brain is like computer hardware and our spirit is like computer software, where they're interacting with one another. But you can't have software without hardware, and you can't have hardware that functions without software.
Well, and it seems to almost be a little bit deeper, that the hardware can influence the software and the software can actually change the hardware too. So it's an even more complex interaction than that. So.
Yeah.
There's often these very provocative headlines that are put out, and while my instinct is to get defensive, what I have learned is that I go read more deeply about the headlines, read the articles. What I often find is that these are topics that people are excited about talking about, and they give me the opportunity to engage in conversations that are already going on and to bring the gospel into those conversations. I'd encourage you to go check out Fazale Rana's Facebook live video. Go to our YouTube channel at Reasons to Believe 1. Look for that video to give you a lot more details and prepare you for those conversations. And look for these provocative headlines so that you can go out and share the gospel. Now let's head over to Monica. She's talking with Anjeanette Roberts about an exciting new book from Reasons to Believe.
Hi, I'm Monica Jones, and today I have Dr. Anjeanette Roberts, who is a research scholar here at Reasons to Believe. First, I want to give it up to AJ for completing her first book. Whoop, whoop, whoop. So I was talking with AJ recently about her book, Building Bridges, and I was really encouraged about what she shared with me, so I asked her to sit and share it with you. So tell me about this book, what inspired it, and what makes it so unique.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm a co-author of the book. There's 3 authors. I co-author with Fuzz and with Jeff. And in 2016, we had an invitation and an opportunity to visit Turkey. We were invited by a group of Muslims, moderate Muslims, to come and speak at a conference on the origins of life and the universe. And, I don't know if you remember, but in 2016, Turkey was undergoing some serious turmoil internally, and we actually were planned to go just 1 month after the attempted coup in Turkey. And so a lot of people were like, are you still going to go? And we're like, yeah, this is a great opportunity because we had the opportunity to speak at an international conference as Christians and as scientists to a primarily Muslim audience. And we were told, please share your Christian views as well as your scientific views as to the origins of life in the universe. And so a lot of our colleagues and friends were a little concerned. They're like, you still going to go? And, Fuzz and I talked about it a couple of times, and we're like, absolutely. Our confidence is in God who's opened this door for us, and we're just going to trust Him. We're going to walk through it and see what opportunities we have to build bridges, which is the title of the book, with a Muslim audience. And so we did, and God was faithful, and it was a great time. And the first conference was so successful that they actually invited us back for a second year. And so Jeff, Fuzz, and I went the first year, and Fuzz and I returned the second year.
Okay. And then, so tell me, what do we find in the chapters that you wrote?
Yeah, so I contributed 2 chapters from the 2 years. One was on evolution, and there I talk about the 5 different ways that the word evolution can be used, and that we need to be careful not to equivocate the different meanings of evolution. And the other chapter is on why would a good God create viruses?
Yes.
And so there I basically talk about viruses, which I always like to talk about.
Yes. Well, I thank you for just going on that, because I remember we were praying and we were here at RTB just thinking, oh my gosh, is this something we want to send us scholars to? And it's so encouraging that you were just open to it. And I thank you, and this is an amazing book. So I think that you guys should check it out. And in the months of May and June, for a donation in any amount, you can get your copy. Just go to reasons.org.
Especially on Pirates Day. Go to reasons.org.
Or reasons.org/2819. I really hope that you get one and build a bridge to someone who needs to know Jesus. You see what I did there?
Aren't you
going
to do that over though?
No, that was good. We'll see you next time.
Once again, you can get your copy of Building Bridges for a donation of any amount during May or June. Visit reasons.org/2819. All right, that about does it for this week. Thanks for joining us on 2819.
And we know that it can be hard to share your faith, so we hope that you've learned some good content that you could just take into conversations with people and share your faith with them.
This show is made possible through the faithful support of Reasons to Believe donors. If you feel led to support resources like this, please visit reasons.org/2819.
And until next time, be sure to check us out on the web at reasons.org. We have tons of great blog posts, articles, podcasts, all great content telling you how God's world and God's word are in harmony.
And make sure you find us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at 2819 Show. And I actually never heard about the Laminin cross before this episode, so I'm curious about what you thought of our segment. So go ahead and leave us a comment and give us some feedback.
See you next week.